I'm Steve McDonald, the Director of Africa Programs here at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of Lee Hamilton, my president, and the Woodrow Wilson Center. Most of you know the center, established as a monument to and a memorial to President Woodrow Wilson in 1968 by Congress. And the whole idea of the center is to try to bring together the world of ideas and the world of policy. And so we sponsor many discussions and presentations like we're going to have this morning. Our format this morning will be as follows. I'll say just a couple of introductory words, and then John Marks, the president and founder of the Search for Common Ground, will come up and introduce the film for us. We'll watch the film, and then shortly after we'll set up a small panel here to lead us in a discussion about the film itself, about its making, about its impact, and generally about the media as a tool for social change. We are very pleased to be able to do this morning. We know, I've been myself doing a lot of work in Kenya and know the tragic and fragile situation there, and the impact of this work that Search for Common Ground is doing is very important. I want to point out and welcome a couple of guests here this morning for your acknowledgement. First of all, Jerry Eddings from the International Center for Foreign Journalists, who co-sponsors this Africa Media series that we do here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Jerry is an old friend and longtime colleague, and I'm very proud to be working with her on this. And then, although she's not on the panel, she certainly could be, Susan Collin Marks, who is the vice president of Search for Common Ground, and also a very close colleague with whom I've worked for many, many years. Now, with no further ado, let me introduce John and have him come up and set up our film for us. We will introduce the other panelists after the film when we get ready to have our discussion. John?
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a huge pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce this film, but first, Search for Common Ground is an international conflict resolution organization. We have offices in 22 countries, and we have a full toolbox, among which is production of media and production of soap opera. And today we're going to be talking about and seeing an example of our soap opera, which we use to promote moderation, to bring people together, to advance ideas of conflict transformation, conflict resolution, mediation inside a society. And we started doing soap opera in Burundi about a dozen years ago on the radio. There was a series called Our Neighbors, Ourselves, and it had about 750 episodes before it actually went off the air. And it was about a Hutu family and a Tutsi family, and they had problems, and their kids had problems, and there was violence all around them, and there were just lots of problems. And in every 20-minute episode, they would solve the problem, only to go on to the next episode, which would come 2 days later, where new problems would arise. And the idea was to change the thinking, the mentality in the society away from a notion that adversarial behavior, that violence was the way to solve problems, into a mode of negotiation, reconciliation, and the like. And, you can say that people like me can write very learned papers and books and the like about how to do this. But if you want to communicate to large numbers of people, masses of people, soap opera is a very effective means. We were reaching at one point, and this was the surveys found this, about 89% of the audience in Burundi. It's a small media market, and there wasn't a lot of competition, and we were doing quality programming, and that's what we were getting, 89%, which is a pretty high percentage of being able to reach people. So that's what we've done. Now, we went on to a place like Liberia. In Liberia, we had a soap opera that was going on for, I think it's been over 1,000 episodes. And there's a character named Charles in that soap opera. And he's very corrupt, this gentleman is. And so now in Liberia, if you want to call somebody corrupt, you say, you're a Charles. And that's what we're trying to do. We're creating new archetypes. Now, this is a negative archetype, but I assure you that Charles's schemes do not triumph. It's right and justice kind of vanquishes Charles in most of the episodes. So, and then we started some television soap. I guess our first one was in Macedonia about 8 or 9 years ago, 10 years ago. And what happened after that, as we became more sophisticated, we started to spread television around because we saw that in places where there was a large television market, you could do more with television. And a young man came to me during last World Cup, in other words, 4 years ago when the World Cup was going on in Germany, and he said, what are we doing? He was one of our interns, actually. He said, what are we doing to take advantage of the World Cup? You know, soccer is the most popular sport in the world. And I said, we weren't doing anything, but we should be. And then we came up with this idea of doing soap opera about soccer, that you could have a soccer team on which would play, on each soccer team in each country where we did this, the diversity of the country would be represented. So in Kenya, you have people from lots of tribes. In Morocco, we have different socioeconomic groups. In Palestine, we have different religions and the like. And the idea was if they didn't play together, they wouldn't score goals. And that was the central metaphor. And then we got a large grant from the UK government, from DFID, the UK Foreign Aid Agency, to produce this in 10 countries. And which wasn't bad. I mean, we were pretty interested. And the Brits are they're soccer mad, or as they would say, football mad. And it was a chance to take this around the world. And when we got the money, we decided that we would double it. In other words, we would get co-funding from others now that we had a big grant from the Brits. And we're pretty much on schedule. We're now up to 15 countries where we're working and the like. So that'll give you an introduction to what you see. But now you should get a sense, because John Sokoloff over there, who's on the panel, made a documentary for the PBS series Now, which says all the things that I'm going to say, much more graphically, with images and pictures, which is the whole idea. People talking are not the best way to communicate the kinds of ideas that we're trying to communicate. So let's look at the film, and then we'll have a chance to talk further. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Now. Movies and TV around the world are saturated with images of violence and horror. But is it possible to use pop culture in a different way to promote peace and understanding across a country?
Millie Mugati is a 26-year-old Kenyan who lives here in the heart of Nairobi. She lives on her own. Her parents died when she was just a teenager, and she was raised by her brother. Life has been a real struggle for Millie, with a lot of uncertainty. But she's got something to look forward to.
It was so emotional. You should have seen the...
Millie is now a working actress. Today, she and her friend Bonaventure are rehearsing some lines together.
And if we win this game, I know he's not going to be so harsh on me.
It's for a new soap opera series that's taking on one of the most serious issues for Kenyans today, the hatred and violence that arise from tribal divisions. The soap opera is called The Team. It's a show about a co-ed team of young soccer players in Nairobi. They're all from different tribes, and in Kenya, tribe is a very big deal.
Listen, is it why you guys chased us from our home?
Even you people did the same. You burnt down our houses. What our property? Was I there?
Millie Mugati is one of the stars. She plays Johari, the captain of the team. She was drawn to the part for its strong female character, but she was intrigued by the show's theme of diversity.
We have characters from each background, the rich, the poor, and the middle class. They've all been affected. It has taken people from all the backgrounds and different tribes and put them together and created a story out of it.
Ah, Johari.
Yes, Coach.
I was coming to congratulate you on the way you handled the team.
Thank you.
And
On screen, she's transformed, wearing a soccer uniform and a different hairstyle. She takes on the role of peacemaker, diffusing hostility and bringing the players together. It's a natural role for her because in her real life, her parents came from two different tribes, and she's always been something of a mediator. To an outsider, tribal conflict can be hard to grasp, especially in a modern nation like Kenya. Long considered an African success story, Kenya has one of the highest GDPs on the continent and a thriving business and tourism industry. But beneath the surface lies a country plagued by corruption, poverty, and increasingly conflict between tribes. At the end of 2007, the tensions, spurred on, many say, by politicians, came to the surface after Kenya's presidential elections. Victory was widely reported to be stolen by the sitting president, a member of the majority Kikuyu tribe. His opponent was from a different tribe. Armed with machetes, stones, even bows and arrows, tribe fought tribe for over a month, leaving almost 1,500 dead and nearly 300,000 Kenyans displaced. Given that history, the program The Team proposes a bold and risky venture. Create a TV show to change the way people think about each other and use it to make them think twice about engaging in tribal violence.
we must forget all our tribal differences if we have to play as a team.
Call it soap opera for social change. But how exactly can a soap opera keep people from killing each other?
I'm not naive. You don't watch one of our television shows and drop your submachine gun. But you can change the environment so it becomes more and more difficult to be in violent conflict.
John Marks is the visionary behind the soap opera The Team. An idealistic young man during the Vietnam era, Marks first worked for the U.S. Foreign Service, but he quit in protest after the invasion of Cambodia in 1970.
I was in this phase of being in opposition, and gradually over the next 4 years during the 1970s, I got to the point where I saw that I was being defined by what I was against. And instead of being against things, I wanted to be for things.
In 1982, Marks founded Search for Common Ground. Its mission is to bring tools for peace building into conflict zones.
I started at the time of the Cold War, and it was the U.S.-Soviet conflict that was moving me. And if you remember, that was at the time of the evil empire, when the idea that I was starting, let's say, wasn't a very popular idea, because we were fighting a Cold War. We weren't finding ways to live together or to work together.
You're the one who's making the mistake. Yeah, what mistake? Rambo.
He came up with the idea to use pop culture when he recognized how many people, especially young people, could be reached by it.
In West Africa, some of the rebel groups used Rambo to train child soldiers. It's a training film. The idea of men being vicious and jumping out of airplanes and cutting each other up and stuff like that can have a really negative impact. And it's the kind of thing that we try to counter.
Marks was impressed by the more positive influence of groundbreaking programs in the U.S. Shows like All in the Family, a radical program when it came out in the 1970s. It opened a dialogue about a once taboo subject in America, racial prejudice.
Well, I thought all colored people call their mothers mammy.
I think that people saw that it wasn't cool to be Archie Bunker, that it wasn't cool to be a bigot, and people had to look at themselves. It's a process, it's a mirror, it's a little bit like therapy that the country goes through.
Through TV and radio, Search for Common Ground has deployed this soft approach towards resolving differences in 20 countries. The point of Common Ground programs isn't to stop people from disagreeing, it's to stop them from killing each other when they do. And Marks is convinced that it works, that it's making people rethink their relationships with their neighbors. How can you actually quantify this? I mean, it may be nice, you may even get great ratings. How do you quantify whether something like your productions, the team, actually have an impact?
We did a series in Macedonia, which went on for 5 years. But after the first year, we did a survey. And we did this in partnership. This was a children's series, and we did it in partnership with Sesame Workshop, Sesame Street folks. And what they found was before watching our series, only 30% of the kids in Macedonia would have invited someone home from a different ethnic group to play after school. After watching only 8 episodes, it went from 30% to 60%. And that was a significant behavior change.
Common Ground's soap opera, The Team, is now in 12 countries, each with its own national version. In places like the Ivory Coast that are dealing with similar deep-rooted ethnic conflict, Marx believes that soccer itself is part of the solution.
The basic premise was that in every country in the world, you would find some division, and you could have a soccer team which had people on all sides of those divides playing for it. And the core metaphor is just very simple. If they don't cooperate, they don't score goals. And from there, you can do anything.
The worldwide popularity of soccer is the key to the whole project. In Kenya, at almost any time of the day, you can find the game being played in every neighborhood. Marx and his group took the world's most popular sport and combined it with one of the world's most popular entertainment formats on radio and TV. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide are hooked on soap operas day and night, many of whose basic themes cross international boundaries, like Ugly Betty. The popular American TV series started as a Colombian telenovela. Now, there are soap opera versions in more than a dozen countries. How important is television, soap operas for Kenyans across the board? Does it really have an influence on them?
You have so many problems, so the only thing you would rather see is watch television, watch a soap opera, drift away, or have your own dreams in your head. So I believe by having these kind of programs, at least Kenyans can associate with, we can entertain them and educate them at the same time.
I mean, the whole script is really good, but this one last sequence is great.
Deborah Jones, a screenwriter from Hollywood, was brought in to help with dramatic structure. But the Kenyan writers are in charge of the storylines and the character details.
The moment you say stupid, you've killed the opportunity for engagement.
Deborah works closely with Mburugu Gikunda, the executive producer in Kenya.
I don't know, what do you think?
Today, the producers are editing a scene with Millie's character, Johari. The coach has just made her the captain of the team because he thinks they're from the same tribe, but they're not.
You know, fate has a way of bringing people from the same blood together. I believe it's only natural. And I mean, we should be proud of it that out of the two of us, one is the coach, the other one is the captain.
And what do you mean by one of us?
Blood is thicker than water.
I see. But I'm not from there. I'm from the other side of the country.
Johari is later told by a coach that I appointed you captain because I thought you came from the same region. And Johari says, no, I don't come from there. And the coach is like suddenly nasty to her.
And what does Johari do?
And Johari does not make the same choice as coach does. She instead chooses to work and motivate the team to a win, and the team wins.
Gikunda chose not to assign specific tribes to the characters or even give them telltale last names. Gikunda, who has worked for years as a media producer in Kenya, agrees that in some cases, the media itself was to blame for provoking those tribal feuds that broke out after the 2007 election. Some of the worst culprits were the dozens of local language radio stations where talk shows stirred up tribal anger in the run-up to the elections.
The things that you write, the things that you say if you're a radio host, the things that you put on TV have the potential to inflame people's passions. and then take them to the level where they probably may take up arms.
These programs, coupled with images of burning buildings and murderous crowds in news reports, kicked off a cycle of revenge attacks.
Do you really believe that somebody who had the capacity to grab a machete and slice another person, a fellow Kenyan, to death, do you honestly believe that if they watch a soap opera about a soccer team on television, that that's actually going to have some kind of an impact?
You sound like you doubt, Maria. The thing is, people do what they do because they don't think there are alternatives. Therefore, when that person is grabbing the machete to attack a neighbor, the guy thinks, I'm at the end of my wits. This is it. This is my best solution.
Gikunda is committed, now more than ever, to using media in positive ways. It's why he's working with Search for Common Ground. There are critics who say that nothing can be done about violence that comes from ancient animosities. But tribal conflict in Kenya is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. There are 42 official tribes in Kenya, and they coexisted more or less peacefully for centuries. But in today's turbulent democracy, there are politicians who use tribal divisions to inflame passions and get votes.
Why, Grandma? Because it's the truth. If we all focus in being different tribes, what makes us Kenyans?
The team pushes back, asking Kenyans of all tribes to think of themselves as Kenyans first.
The first thing she asked was, what's a tribe?
In the real lives of the actors, this issue of tribe is ever present. In an actors' meeting, this young man, Wayan Mwita, tells us that he has a half-sister from a different tribe. And ever since the election in 2007, she's refused to speak with him.
She disconnected any communication up to this minute as you're speaking. We don't communicate, and she's my sister. Even mom doesn't communicate. Even if you call with a private number or a different number, she'll pick nicely, and after identifying herself, she'll disconnect. Just like that.
Wayan plays a character called Ali, a young, by-the-book law student. He's never experienced violence until he gets his first taste on a trip to the slums with his teammate Kazia.
Hey, what's going on over there?
Her brother is nearly beaten to death in a fight, and Ali gets in the middle to break it up. When we meet up with the actors, it's halfway through the first season. The producers have asked some of them to go on a mission that could be dangerous.
Naivasha, where it actually happened and where...
Holding screenings in villages and slums where violence was at its worst.
You're not afraid to speak out?
No, I'm not. I'm not afraid to speak out because, as you can see, my environment, you have to be a strong person. You have to learn to fight for yourself since you are growing. You have to learn how to speak your mind and ask for your right, or else if you don't do that, people are going to step on you. And with that, I've learned it really helps. I've learned to speak for myself, and I'm not afraid.
We join Millie and two cast members, Ruth Mangi, who plays the assistant coach Beth, and Kevin Yatur, who plays Ben, as they travel to their first screening in Naivasha, about an hour from Nairobi. Naivasha was a hotspot, one of those towns where angry calls for retaliation fueled mob violence. 2 months after the election, almost 50 people were dead and 10,000 people had been chased from their homes.
Maybe there are violent guys there, you never know. And maybe they are planning something.
In the car ride up to the screening, the actors spoke about their very real fears of what might happen. They worried that the TV show they hoped would spark peace might suddenly backfire, and the actors themselves could be attacked.
My biggest worry is, when you have a crowd, it's hard to control the crowd. And there's always issues of group psychology, which, because it's a group thing, the effect of a group is bad.
We arrive on the dusty outskirts of Naivasha. Today, the streets are eerily quiet, occupied by people trying to survive in the daily poverty that persists throughout Kenya. At the community center reserved for the screening, a group of school children welcomes us with a performance of Ring Around the Rosie. The nervous actors loosen up. Many in this area don't have TVs, so the screening has drawn a large crowd, a diverse group that comes from many different tribes.
I want you to put this into your damn heads. I am not going to tolerate any kind of indiscipline around here. No, will you play together, or would you rather stick to your own kind and play separately?
After the screening, the floor is open to the audience, and instead of angry reactions, a lively debate begins. And they aren't just talking about tribe either. Some say that women have no place on a soccer team.
You men give women a lot of stress, and they must and they handle it.
As the screening comes to a close, the actors and producers tell us their mobile mission accomplished just what they hoped. It got people talking about issues rather than fighting about them.
I was very, very surprised because to see how much Kenyans want to change, how they want to live in peace, and the way they responded to us, they're so welcoming, they opened up their hearts, and to find that there were people from different tribes talking about peace, reconciliation, they've forgiven each other, it really encouraged me, and I was very happy.
The show has struck a nerve with Kenyans. According to ratings, it's reaching over 2 million people on TV, and millions more tune in by radio. But not everyone is convinced that the show can heal the wounds caused by Kenya's tribal divisions. Remember those graphic images of the election violence? They were taken by this young photographer, 26-year-old Boniface Mwangi. Boniface grew up in a neighborhood just like this, selling trinkets on the street to survive.
So you could have been anybody?
Yeah, actually, their life is my life. Their story is my story. I understand them.
This is Kibera, East Africa's biggest slum. Home to almost 1 million people, about half of them unemployed. It was here in Kibera that tribal attacks first broke out when the results of the elections were announced.
I've seen a lot of killings. I saw the worst. I saw human beings becoming beasts. I saw blood flowing in the streets.
Boniface says tribal conflict will continue as long as the country's leaders benefit by it.
All of them represent a tribe. So they're stealing in the name of tribe, but they're stealing for themselves and stashing the money abroad.
When you think of the images that you've taken, the violence that you've seen, and you think of a soap opera like The Team, can it have an impact?
But now you're getting professional actors to try and stimulate what happened. And they don't have the emotions, they don't have the gist of the story.
But Millie understands the story only too well. In late 2007, the violence was right on her doorstep.
During the post-election violence, what was your neighborhood like?
There was a tribe that was planning to attack the others, so it got to a point we had to get arms. You have to get a machete, put it in the house. Yeah, I have a panga, like a metal rod, just in case they attack you at night.
Fortunately, that attack never happened, but it's still hard for Millie to look at Boniface's photos of what did happen.
We were possessed at that time, like nobody was really in their minds when this was happening. So it's just, I can't look at the pictures for a long time.
And just recently, the team experienced a real-life tragedy. Shortly after our visit to Kenya, one of the actors, Wayan Mwita, who plays Ali, the guy who saved a friend from being beaten to death in the show, was himself beaten to death in a street attack. The motive is still unknown. For the team, it's a terrible blow and a cruel reminder of the everyday realities they hope to take on through their TV show.
We're changing the political vocabulary, and that's an incredibly important thing in areas where conflict, because to have conflict, to have violence, you need to be able to dehumanize the other side. And if you can rehumanize them, if you can give them real life and you get into their problems and you see their problems the same as your problems, then you're talking about changing things.
So far, the team has been a big hit with young people. And just this month, they'll begin production on season 2. The producers hope they're touching hearts and minds throughout the country. And for the passionate young actors who make up the team, the show has allowed them to dream.
What is your dream for your country?
My dream for my country is for Kenyans to think as one. For Kenyans to realize that tribalism is not the problem that we are facing. The problem that we are facing is illiteracy, education, and bad governance. And we can have a good governance, then that's just what we need.
Thank you very much. Give us just a few moments to set up the living room here, and we'll proceed. Thank you very much, John. Extremely good film. As we get started, we want this to be an open and pretty free format for you to join in and ask your questions. Obviously, the film poses one of the key questions. That's the sustainability of the impact. The Woodrow Wilson Center, as some of you may know, has been very involved in collaborative training and workshops with leadership in some of the conflict countries of Africa, in the DRC, Congo, in Burundi, and in Liberia. And in the 8 years we've been doing that, we have begun to see a cumulative impact of bringing leaders together to create the trust and the capacity to work together. And these are the kinds of things that I think you see happen over time. One of the good things about the efforts that John has been leading here with Search for Common Ground is, of course, they've been able to sustain it for a while. So I think that's one of the key questions we want to look at. Let me also just say one word, a personal word about John Marks and the work that he's done. I know when I went to work with a gentleman named Dick Clark, former senator and head of the Africa Subcommittee at Aspen Institute in the mid and late 1980s, doing some work on South Africa. I remember one of the first things he said was, one of the guys you got to meet is John Marks. He also said I needed to read Roger Fisher's Getting to Yes. I think they were both good hints on how to move forward in reconciliation and conflict transformation work. So let's now turn to the panel. Actually, while we're still setting up the microphones, maybe I'll just do the introduction from here, so we'll know who's up here. John's already been introduced. We're very, very pleased to have him. John Sisseloff is, as you heard, has been an executive producer for PBS's show Now, and he did that from 2001 to 2009. He's the founder of Jumpstart Productions, which aims to provide tools for engaged citizens. He's an award-winning broadcast news producer with over 20 years of experience with various agencies, including NBC and ABC and CBS. Then we are very happy to have Sylvia Vollenhoven, who is South African. She is a Knight Development Journalist Fellow who is leading a project to improve coverage on poverty and development issues in Ghana. And she's also a journalist and a media trainer, as I said, from South Africa. She's the founder of Vision in Africa, a media organization which is spearheading several training initiatives. And she's recently brokered a collaboration between key African partners to launch the Africa Means Business, AMB project, which is a Pan-African training initiative for business journalists and serves as a facilitator for the pilot training seminar. And we've also just been told, not in her formal bio, that she's done some soap opera work as well in South Africa. So I think they'll all be good additions to what we're trying to get to. Okay, we'll open with some responses from our panelists, but I'll ask them to make them short. I think one good scene setter for us all will be just to know a little bit about our audience, though, and just not to ask you to introduce yourself. There are far too many of you, but just how many of you are involved in journalism or professionally, or involved in conflict resolution kind of project work through NGOs, through government agencies, who might have had an opportunity to see the results of this kind of work or be aware of it in the field. Just let's see a show of hands of how many were journalists, involved in journalism, involved in conflict resolution work. Well, that's a good half of our audience. So we should get a good discussion going here. Now, we are being televised and webcast, so when we get to the question and answer phase, we will have microphones to pass around, so always wait for the microphone to arrive so we can get your voice on the recording as well. But let's just open up. We'll start with John, because he's our guru here.
Well, you know, you've seen about what we were doing, but I want to tell you some individual reactions, just one. People have watched this thing and they've had their whole life changed. And I'm thinking of the example of a Luo man who was married to a Kikuyu wife, and she got raped during the Troubles. And he threw her out of the house because he said she deserved it and she brought it on herself, and anyway it had to do with her tribe, which is a pretty harsh reaction. And what happened is that the husband came to one of those showings. He went through this experience, and incidentally, the group that came together in that showing in Navasha came 6 times. We showed 2 episodes each time, and then there was a facilitated discussion afterwards, and they were all community leaders. They were people from their tribes, so we were working in trouble spots to get the leadership. And this particular guy saw it, and he got up in front of everybody else, and he said that I've forgiven my wife and I've brought her back into the household, in the fold, because I've seen this show. So you can have that kind of impact. I wouldn't have tried to have had such a big impact, if you will. I wouldn't have claimed it in the beginning, but it did happen.
Cool. John.
It's a pleasure to be here, and John Marks and Susan are special friends. We were delighted to be able to collaborate to do this film. It's part of a long series we did in the period of 9 years that we ran the show now on PBS that we called Solutions-Oriented Journalism. Because what we found is that if you look at journalism, most of it is about all the bad things happening. And one of the effects we know is it drives people away from engagement with the world. They retreat, they nest, they draw back from engagement. Solutions-oriented journalism is looking at change makers. And we feel, and you may have sensed this from Maria Hinojosa's questions, you have to be tough-minded about this. You can't go in saying, we are going to do a piece of fluff about the team because we think it's a good idea and we're going to sell it. Because the audience, and I'm not speaking just of the American audience, the audience in Kenya and around the world, they see a lot of media and they have a lot of common sense. They know when you're trying to sell them something. So you can see that we came in with an attitude which was not skeptical, but critical. Because the other side of it is, I think you have to push change makers to answer those questions. These are the kind of natural things that people will say. How is this going to make a difference? I'll say just a couple other things, so I'm really anxious to hear your questions and Sylvia's remarks. It's very important not to stop just thinking of the film, or in this case, the soap opera series, as the object, and you put it out there and it magically unfolds and blossoms. There's a whole bunch, and the word John used was the toolkit. There's a whole bunch of other things that really are essential if you're going to bring about social change. And part of this is engagement with people before, during, and after. And there's a lot of discussion we can have about the best ways to do that. And it obviously includes online and social networking, but it also includes, a whole range of continuing engagement and community. And the other thing I would say is that I think that there are tremendous opportunities in this country. I worked in Africa for 5 years, and I'm deeply connected to the efforts to make a difference there. But I think there are great opportunities in this country to use media as a medium, as a leverage point for transformation. And I really believe that we have a tremendous opportunity here of people who want to be empowered, who are looking for solutions, who are looking for another way to move forward. And we have to be, all of us, thinking critically about how to do that. Thank you, Steve.
Sylvia.
Well, thanks. I think it's a tremendous project, and I've looked at it on the internet and really watched some of the episodes. And I come at it from two kinds of perspectives. One as a professional, but also my idea of a great Sunday morning is watching an omnibus of my favorite soap opera. So I'm a great soap fan, and South Africa has a tremendously good collection of soap operas, and my favorite being one called Isidingo. And so on a Sunday morning for 3 hours when I'm back at home, I watch Isidingo. And Isidingo tackles some really critical social issues. But the difference between what you're doing and what Isidingo does for me as a consumer is that the issues are deeply hidden in story. That story and narrative is much more important than didactic and pedagogic issues. So I think while I really enjoyed watching the team, I kept thinking, how would this work in South Africa, where there is probably a very competitive selection of entertainment by comparison with a lot of other African countries. And I feel it would work partly, and partly it wouldn't work. So some of the projects that I've been involved in was a soap opera, a drama for youth called Yizo Yizo. And that worked so well. It addressed the issue of violence and drugs and gangsterism in schools. And it worked so well that it got the entire society talking. It had the highest primetime figures, and the SABC almost took it off air. In fact, they didn't recommission it after the last series because it was too effective. And the youth liked it too much, and they felt that at some point the message wasn't getting across as much as the behavior. So some of these things work and some of them don't work. What we also tried that was very successful was doing an educational sitcom and teaching people in the early days of the new South Africa around the time of the transition about new labor legislation, which was very, very complex, and flipping some of the characters, using a black woman as the nasty capitalist boss, for instance. But what the good ones have in common that I've worked with is that no matter how worthy or important your message, your characters have to have complexity. Your characters have to have the full range of emotion. And when the characters have the full range of emotion, you elicit emotions in the audience. For instance, a very good example being the coach and the captain having a discussion around her position. For me, it would have been a bit more compelling if there was some kind of love interest across this tribal difference. And so while I really enjoyed watching the team, I could see a lot of the things that we had tried to do in South Africa in the early days. And what is happening all over Africa is the television is changing very, very rapidly. It's one medium where people are really learning very fast, and the difference in quality and the difference in narrative quality between what exists in the various countries and what exists between Africa and the West, the gap is narrowing considerably and very fast. So that I would like to see the team in the future maybe compete with those popular soap operas, because soap is commercial and it might look superficial, but it's exactly the opposite. It actually comes from a very deep place. It comes from our folklore. It comes from stories that are very deep inside us, and it comes from our mythology. And although it's dressed up in this commercial and superficial facade, it reaches us because it understands story, and it understands narrative, and it understands depth. So yeah, that's my comment.
Well, thank you, Sylvia. As we throw it open to discussion, we certainly welcome, we want your questions, but welcome your sense of experiences too. Let's keep our comments relatively short to give many people a time to talk and to get involved. But we see that you're vastly experiences yourself, and so some reflections on experiences you've had and how you've seen it work out. So let's start taking some audience participation here. Well, I could take the chair's prerogative to kick us off because John mentioned, and I made allusion to it too, that obviously the power of media in a divided society in particular is large. We've known that for a long time, but we've known it mostly by its negative examples. The Radio Mio Colline in Rwanda that spurred a lot of the awful violence there in 1994, but we saw it in Burundi as well. And I have been aware of your soap opera in Burundi on the radio there for the last 8 years and the power that it's had. But we see that throughout, mostly in indigenous language radio around conflicts, which you're seeing in the Eastern Congo right now as we're speaking. I know that you're developing a project for the Congo as well, but how do you see this countering that negative media, which is so powerful? We've seen its results.
Well, the opposite of hate media is not love media. Mm-hmm. We think it's something called common ground radio or common ground media. And whatever the country is, I think it can be countered and can be shifted. And just what Sylvia was saying, we're using local writers, so what's going on in Kenya is not nearly as, what I would say, as sophisticated if we were on the air in South Africa. In other words, all we say for the team is that it needs to be about a soccer team at the core of it. And genocide can't win out or violence can't win out. In other words, that is the didactic part of this. The kind of the coming together part has to win in the end. But it's up to the local writers within that framework to take it any further. So if we were producing in South Africa, which I'd love to do, but we've never found the right local producer, somebody like Soul City would be a possibility to do this. We would probably do a very different, if you will, more sophisticated version of it, because I think that's what the writers would reflect, because there's a real soap opera history. In Kenya, with all due respect, you see soap operas which are about 3 people sit in a room and then one murders somebody else with a pistol and leaves. And that's not the highest level of dramatic engagement that you would ever find.
So not a lot of competitive competition, as you were saying.
Yeah.
On the issue of sophistication, I think it's a good argument, but it falls away when you look at what's happening in Nigeria. And I consume a fair amount of Nollywood. Some of the products that I really, really like. And there's a Nigerian filmmaker whose work I have at home. He raises a bit of money and then goes and makes a few episodes of a series called Abeni, where the heroine is a young girl from Benin who has fallen in love with a rich Nigerian guy. And these things are not sophisticated, but they are extremely popular and they're very effective. And they're effective because the story is important. And because the characters, we care about the characters because they are credible characters. A good example being the kid saying what makes us Kenyan to his grandmother in that clip. A kid wouldn't talk like that. So the characters in Abeni, for instance, especially now that I'm working in West Africa, I see them all around me. I can really relate to them. And so it's important that we don't, as passionate as we are about the issues, that we don't put words in people's mouths.
Okay, I finally see a hand. Let's take the closest one to the microphone right there beside you. Introduce yourself, please.
Hi, my name is Bailey Butzberger. I'm with Microfinance Opportunities. I actually have 2 questions. First, I was wondering, you touched on there was a man who was an obvious success story after following the program, but have you done a broader impact study after airing the show? And secondly, I don't know, you also spoke about sustainability of the show. I don't know what the timeline is for it, but how do you see the show evolving? Do you anticipate tackling other issues as time goes on?
Maybe we'll take one more question and then try to lump them together. Right in the middle here, yeah. See the
William Seymour, International Peace Quest Institute. I was actually rather interested in the dialogue between Mr. Marks and Ms. Vollenhoven. Am I saying that right? Just in as much as I think I would expect there to be a difference between a very large, probably much more media savvy market such as South Africa and a smaller market like Kenya. I mean, to what extent would it be possible to make the plot of a show like The Team more complex, more advanced, the way that Ms. Vollenhoven was saying, in the South African market, in the Kenyan market, as compared to the South African market, where there's probably more funding and a greater consumer base and just the ability to do a lot more with what they have. I mean, to what extent is that practical, and to what extent is The Team, maybe just very sufficient, very regular for the Kenyan market, where it doesn't need to do that much more? Thank you.
All right, let's take those.
Okay. On the evaluations question, we do comprehensive before and after survey research and focus groups to make sure we're making a difference with this stuff. And also, we look at the ratings. In Kenya, we've gone as high as the number 3 in the country, and we're consistently in the top 10. And that's a pretty good evaluation that for that market, it's working. So that's it. And there was another the last question. Sustainability. In the world of television, that's called commercial sponsorship. And in Kenya, we now have, I believe, Del Monte Foods and Zane's cell phones are coming in for the 2nd season, when incidentally the coach does fall in love with Johari. They've waited on that one.
So you invented Windows 7 now.
So you're a good. And in Morocco, for example, where we're on the air, we're getting about 1/3 of our costs paid for by the local TV station. One of the problems, however, that's the TV network. One of the problems with doing this is we're working in countries where there's not really much of a commercial market. I mean, in Burundi, there's nobody who could pay for this in a commercial sense, or who would. So you have to make a choice, and we would love to be doing the same thing in Europe. You could conceive of a team in the Netherlands that had Moroccans and Africans and native Dutch people on it, and it would be a totally different show than anything we're doing in Africa. And we'd like to do that. However, our major funders are foreign aid agencies, DFID, USAID, those kinds of people, and they don't fund in the Netherlands, so it has to be a commercial show. And we think the series worldwide will be sustainable, but I'm not sure that all the pieces will be sustainable.
And then the last question, though, I think was...
Sylvia had this.
Well, yeah, we don't want to...
Well, no, it was on the last question that I was going to say something. I think it was William Sima was asking that... It brought to mind something we did at the SABC to address that issue. It wasn't that South Africans knew anything about television. As recently as '94, we were producing the most awful products that passed for television. But what we did was we formed collaborations with people who know these things. And we formed a collaboration between the Binger Film Lab in the Netherlands, for instance, and various other training institutions around the world, and some consultancy in the UK, ex-BBC types. And before getting local people, local writers and directors to go out there and produce, we put them into a rather intense project called the Sadiba Project, where the writers and the producers and directors were trained together in collaboration with foreign nationals. And then out of that kind of greenhouse project came still some very, very rough scripts, and even then we had to refine it further. And the first series of some of these things that came out, we did a project called Shakespeare in Mzansi, where you took traditional literary works and transposed them to current African reality. And some of them that came out of this project that I've just described were absolutely brilliant and have been shown at festivals all over the world. So in a short time, you can make the project and the product a lot more universal and have a lot more complexity, but it's about collaboration with people who know how to do it.
John?
want to refer to the question about sustainability because I think it's a market-by-market basis. But I've been running a show in the United States, and sustainability is, I think all of us should be addressing that issue. And the fact of the matter is, the market does not tilt towards solutions. The market does not tilt towards peace and dialogue. If Rambo gets a big number, take a look. Walk into the multiplex, boys and girls. Take a look at what's out there, and that's not an accident. And people, there are people falling in love and, all that kind of stuff. But, what's driving the numbers? It's, at the moment, actually, it's cartoon, films. And the biggest numbers are global numbers. They're from Africa. They're from Asia, these people that are shooting and blowing each other up. So I think we have to look at, sustainability as a long-term goal. But it's very often that if you start if you start from the perspective that I'm going to find something that immediately makes money, you're going to go down a path that's going to really subvert your goals.
Okay, I saw a hand here, Justine, to begin with, and then we'll try to work to the back of the room a little bit. So we'll take
Hi.
3 questions.
Yep. My name is Allison. I work at AED, Center for Civil Society and Governance, and I actually worked on a project in Kosovo, which was bringing together Kosovo and Serbian youth in a 10-part reality TV show. So we're using the reality TV model to sort of bring together youth. And this was happening right after, about 2 months after Kosovo declared independence. So you can imagine doing the casting call in an environment where these youth were putting themselves at great risk, actually, to be a part of the show. And so it's just really a comment to just sort of emphasize how courageous these individuals are who participate in shows like that, particularly in extremely divided societies. My second point is actually a question, which I'd like you to expand a little bit more on sort of the marketing question of sustainability, because in Kosovo and Serbia, there are TV shows that are more than just sort of violent TV shows that are in the market that are getting sponsorship. Sitcoms are actually the highest grossing TV show in both Serbia and Kosovo, but we ran into a lot of difficulties getting buy-in because of the political divisiveness of the subject and sponsors turning away from it because of that, both international and local. And so I'm just wondering if you've had to face that challenge before, and whether or not there's any good solutions to try to get buy-in in very political moments of time. It was a DRL-funded project, so we had a specific timeline to implement the project. As I said, it was right after Kosovo declared its independence, so it wasn't an ideal time to be doing this type of work. But I'm just curious about whether or not you've had other experiences. And my second question involves, again, sustainability and using other media tools to enhance the community around the show. So, for instance, using things like Facebook or SMS text messaging for voter responses and things like that, whether or not there's been experience using that and how successful it's been.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Maybe tied into that question, let's go to the back. The next hand was right at the back there. Maybe tied into that question was Sylvia mentioned in terms of political pressure as well, that you experienced. I think SABC was obviously under political pressure for that sitcom there, East Single.
Thank you, Ab. My name is Nobuo Fukura. I'm a journalist with Asahi Shimbun, the Japanese daily newspaper. I'd like to know if you have any difficulties in dealing with the government, when you shot the show and they put it on air, in terms of censorships.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll take one more, maybe the gentleman right beside him there.
My name is Rob Buchanan. I'm with the El Hebrew Charitable Foundation. Just kind of a question. I was a bit troubled by something that John Marks said earlier when he was talking about the example of the Luo man who had seen the program and forgave, I think is the word you used, his wife who had been raped, and she was with a different tribe. And I was just thinking that if that was the result of his, forgiving his wife for being raped or for being from a different tribe, it just seemed to me that it wasn't necessarily necessarily the message that you wanted him to to get from that experience. It seemed to me that maybe he wasn't really getting it, but there's probably more to it than that. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. But my question really is about the Kenyan example focused on tribal differences, and I'm wondering if you focus on religious differences and whether that makes for a different kind of script, a different kind of set of problems, and whether in fact you are looking at religious differences as well.
Well, that's a broad range.
Okay, that question about we're promoting reconciliation, and the forms of it may not be reconciliation that everybody in this room thinks are useful, but I think them coming back together is much more useful than them being apart, even though we may not like some of the underlying values. And we're taking the storytelling tradition in each country and working with it as it is and pushing the limits. We're not trying to impose upon them, if you will, an American or a Western notion of how reconciliation could take place. So I just would say that very strongly. And the writing, the situations are not being done by people who look like me. They're being done by people who live there, who are writers, and they have to do it within a framework of, say, of reconciliation. But they're the ones who come up with the plot. And, you know, this gets to the sustainability question. The American way of producing is that you produce in Hollywood, and then it's bought around the world. And sometimes it's hugely successful, an Avatar or Star Wars, which people around the world adapt as their own symbols. We're doing something very different. We're a decentralized organization which is doing all its production locally, not internationally. And so in every country, it's different. Every country has its own storytelling tradition. Every country has its own way of communicating, and that's what we're trying to tap into. Our premise is that's at least as effective or more effective than kind of this centralized Hollywood talks to the world, or the United States or Western Europe talks to the world way of going about it. But I'm not sure I could prove that, you know, with data. That's just our sense that people are going to identify more with what's relevant to them locally than what comes in from 10,000 miles away.
I just want to pick up on 2 points, and the one is working with local talent, because a lot of what I've been doing around Africa is training people, and it's not so much that one has not to, that you should not interfere with local storytelling. It's about marrying structure and professional tools with local storytelling. A lot of the journalists that I work with, especially, they are steeped in storytelling traditions. They know what a good story is, and they consume really good stories, and they're part of rich folkloric cultures. But when you ask them to write a piece of journalism, they write what they think you want to hear, and they write what they think their English teacher in grade 12 wanted to hear. And so it's terrible, and you can't allow that to pass unadulterated, because it just won't have an audience. And then the second point is the point about audience and the myth that the market dictates what we want. When I was part of a small group of people that spearheaded the change from the SABC, from a state broadcaster in the apartheid era to a public broadcaster. And when we took over, we found that the most popular soap opera was The Bold and the Beautiful. It had the highest ratings in prime time, and still in various parts of Africa, it's still on air at the SABC, and it still has very high ratings. But then we started to develop our own soap operas, and within a few years, just within 2 years, the youth program that I mentioned earlier, and the South African soap that we sell everywhere called Generations, just shot way beyond The Bold and the Beautiful. So it's not always that the market knows. The market is reacting to what they think the choices are. And when you broaden the choices with programming like this that has different different values, that has a different mission, and that has their interests at heart, but that also entertains them in a way that they can consume, in the way that they can understand, then you have a winner. And I think it's about taking risks.
I want to just for a moment return to your question about expanding beyond the production or the airing or broadcast of an event, because I think that is absolutely key if the goal is social change. And I think we're really seeing a moment in Africa. The cell phone is going to be the primary connection to the computer and to the internet. I mean, instead of a computer, or it is the computer in everyone's hand, and it's so ubiquitous. And now on PBS, we had a monster social networking, Facebook, web-based conversation that was the beginning of a dialogue. But we also tried a number of experiments where we sponsored Now on PBS clubs. People would watch and then discuss. Because I really do believe that there is tremendous value to having people being part of the discussion and being not just a participant, but feeling that they're a producer or a storyteller, or part of the storytelling community. I think that's huge because it's about ownership. It's not just their product that I'm being pushed at, but it's something that we care about the characters, we care about their interaction, and reacting to how people and suggesting what people should do or not do. But I also believe that guided discussion that goes beyond because it's a kind of crazy world out there in social networking. Those of you who have worked in it, and there's the capacity for kind of not necessarily chaotic, but a lot of unformed and unfocused stuff flying around, and guided discussion has value.
Yeah. Let me add that what you've seen on the screen, the television program, is only the beginning of what's a national campaign in Kenya, which includes social networking. We have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have Flickr, but we also are in 1,000 schools. We're using the tapes and facilitated discussions to get kids into a kind of a mode where they're learning the values. We're organizing a national soccer tournament. You may have noticed, nobody's brought it up yet, that the team was half boys and half girls. That was something I might not have even dared to do, but our writers said, let's try it. And it seemed like a good idea, so we said, fine. We have final script approval. We're not going to let bad stuff get on the air. But that was a good idea. So we're having a national soccer tournament with mixed teams of boys and girls where they have to be from different tribes too. So it's gender and ethnically mixed. And that's going to attract a lot of attention in the country. And there's, in Kenya, in the slums, in places like Kibera and Mathare, there are tens of thousands of kids already in football leagues, soccer leagues. And that becomes a place where we can have showings of this, which costs us about $2 a piece for the DVD. And then there's a facilitated discussion afterwards. So it's becoming a bit of a social movement. And the soap opera part, the drama, is only part of what's happening. It's the launch point. The characters, the ideas come from it, but we see it as a way, particularly in Kenya, to take a whole country away from the violence which many people think is likely to happen again with the next elections.
We still have to pick up the question on the government censorship. Any problems with that?
Okay. Excuse me, I'm doing more of the talking, but I think I know it. It depends on the country, frankly. In Kenya, it's not the slightest problem. Also, we're taking a soft approach. It's a soft power approach. So nobody's put us all on the air. We're about to go on the air in Zimbabwe, however, and that may be a little more difficult and a little more problematic. But if you don't confront it directly, if you kind of, use soft power, an Aikido type approach, it's not usually a problem. We're not doing investigative documentaries here, but we have had some problems. I want to say there's one African country where we lost our broadcaster for about 3 months because we were too hard-hitting, even with our soap opera approach. But we found a commercial broadcaster. It was luckily Nigeria, where there were alternatives. And so it can be a problem, but it's a problem to be danced with, and it's much less of a problem for us than, say, people who are doing investigative journalism. journalism.
And then one other question was on based on religious differences rather than.
Okay. Yeah, it depends on the conflict. In Kenya, there's some Muslim Christian stuff. In Nigeria, there was a huge amount of Muslim Christian stuff, as much as tribal things. In Palestine, where we just went on the air last week, it's Muslim Christian is one of the big issues. Gender issue, generational, whatever conflicts they have, we do. And we try to get the bigger ones.
Okay, let's get some new blood. Right there in the center. Justine.
Hi, thanks for being here. Benedict Teagarden, I'm with the Stimson Center. My question, which maybe you all can touch on, is about the durability of this approach. Because it seems like what you're doing, and it seems like you're having positive results, is trying to almost change social discourse to promote this idea of unity. However, social relations are only part of it. There's also the whole political economy of these countries. So what I wonder is, if there is a new point of tension, whatever that point may be, whatever the catalyst is, if it is a new election, like you said, or if there's a change in the economy, whatever it may be, how durable do you think your message will be when you're trying to change just the social discourse, but perhaps the political or the economic, or rather the political economy hasn't changed, the people, they live in this context with the politics and the economics. So if there's another election and these other media sources, these kind of divisive media sources resurface, how durable do you think yours will stack up against those given a time of crisis?
The change that we're trying to effect here is one of problem solving. It's a way of changing how they deal with problems. So it would work just as well with political or economic problems. And in fact, the plots reflect that too. Class stuff. In Morocco, we're doing rich kids against poor kids. And so we're talking about an attitudinal shift that supports things. Did Archie Bunker change America? I think he did. And does that persist? It does. We've just elected a president of the United States who, shows to me that we've changed attitudes considerably since when Archie Bunker first went on the air, or The Cosby Show, which will also be a contributor. But these changes are harder to measure. What I'm saying here is there's a lot of evidence that this form can have a big effect, and some of it will die. And if there's a huge war or there's a huge overwhelming thing, this stuff gets swept aside. I don't have any illusions that this is so powerful that it withstands other kinds of things. But I think you're talking about a gradual attitudinal consciousness shift, and I think that can work.
And part of the answer to that question is that what Search for Common Ground has been doing, and others as well, is all done in a broader context of conflict resolution and post-conflict recovery. The kind of work that the Woodrow Wilson Center does, for instance, in working with leadership elements in societies like Burundi, in trying to rebuild trust and rebuild collaborative relationships, negotiations, communications, is done in a very private way, no media coverage. It's personal transformation of leaders so they can work collaboratively on the agendas of governance and development and poverty reduction and et cetera. But we all do that together. We're aware of the work we do. We often collaborate in countries, and it's not just Search for Common Ground, the Woodrow Wilson Center, many other NGOs and government agencies that are working out there. So it is a whole approach that has to be taken before you're going to impact any given conflicted society.
I think the question of durability is very important because it's also an economic question. And from our experience, we found that there are certain series we can bring back and we can do repeats years later. And those are the series where the narrative qualities have been very strong and where whatever issues they dealt with have, as I said earlier, been just very deeply embedded in story.
There's also television durability in the sense that our shows are getting repeated 3 or 4 times, and CFI, the international French broadcaster, has bought a couple of them, and we've just had a sale for East Africa, and we hadn't thought this was going to happen, but it's just going on and on and on. And repeats are the lifeblood of television, though you should be paid for them. We don't usually get paid for them, but we're very happy just to have the content out there further.
Yeah, the original Star Trek only became popular with its repeats, not in its original run.
Durability, I think, is a key issue, but I also think it's there's sort of the static notion of the politics is immutable and continuing, whereas you get into this area of popular culture and popular change, and it can just lead in interesting places. And look at America. Who would have thought the two mavericks would have represented the two political parties in the last election? It was a change that was unanticipated, and I actually believe that this is all what we're talking about and talking around the edges of is a notion of media as a piece, and maybe a smaller piece than some of us would like to imagine, as a piece of change that emerges from popular culture and from people whose views may diverge from the official version, from the political economy. And in the end, even in many of these societies which have huge governance problems, there are cracks. There are ways in which popular culture has demonstrated impact. And I think one of the other things is it's a global cultural world, and people in Kenya look across at South Africa, and there is a bonus and a benefit when popular culture has an impact in one place. I think it contributes to the durability of change.
Okay, I've seen some patient and persistent hands right here and here, the two ladies in the same row, all the way across, Justine. Yeah, 1, 2.
Hi, I'm Claire Wild from Georgetown University, and I was wondering both about how you were to find the local writers and their educational background, how representative they are of the various local populations, and also the choice of language of production in terms of whether or not it's dubbed into any of the local languages or their subtitles. So, thank you.
Okay, and just to the... Yes.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Komla from the National Academy of Sciences. I was wondering if you can share some insights on, how such media initiatives have been popular or successful in the rest of the world. I mean, are there any initiatives that you spearheaded in the past in the other parts of the world, and do you think you found they have made a positive impact on the people?
Okay, thank you. Let's take those questions. Yeah.
Okay. As to how we find people, we always work with a local partner. So we'll go into an investigation of who's either the production house or the NGO we want to work with. In Kenya, we found a media NGO we had been working with for a long time, which you saw Barugu, the guy who was on screen. Well, he'd been the program director of KTN, which is one of the biggest Kenyan networks, and he knew how to do it. And we did some empowering. We found the money and we helped in the organizing, but he did it all. And that makes us look really smart, and we got a very good production out of it. And, we're producing right now, we're on the air in 5 different countries, and we have 3 full-time people working on this project. Now, there are thousands of people on each production, but we're not doing it, and it's kind of an empowerment strategy. As for language, whatever is the local language of television is the language we use. So that show is in this combination of English and Swahili, which limits the market in other places because the Swahili is hard for people to understand. That's how Kenyans talk to each other. The radio version of it, and there is a radio version in Kenya, is in 5 vernacular languages. But it's hard to do TV in vernacular languages. And then the other thing I would say is an adaptation. You didn't quite ask this. We're just going into production in Pakistan, and in Pakistan we're using cricket as opposed to soccer because that's the local sport. All we need is a team sport. I don't happen to know anything about cricket, but there are an awful lot of people who can give us cricket advice.
And the question about any other media initiatives elsewhere that you're aware of that were...
Other organizations?
Well, other media initiatives is the words you used. I assume you mean individuals or organizations that had the same kind of impact in other...
Well, there are a lot of people in the health field and the prevention of HIV/AIDS. Population Media Center does this kind of... There are 2 or 3. The genre of using soap opera for social change actually started in Latin America. In Mexico, I think, were the first ones about 40 years ago. with about contraception and preventing unwanted pregnancies and things like that. So there's a whole other field. As far as I know, we're the only ones who are doing it around the world for reasons of conflict resolution. You might find in South Africa that they're doing, their programs going, but we tend to be global in the sense, and it's a form, and there are a lot of people doing public service announcements, where you have a short announcement, some of which are just advertisements for better behavior, and others of which can be more dramatic. So one of the problems is that the development agencies, the foreign aid agencies, don't really see this as fitting except in a propaganda way. So they don't usually, it's just starting that you're having guidelines, and you can find a way to get funded by them, but it doesn't usually come because they put out a call. An exception is the State Department, which has been doing a call for 2 years on Muslim-Western improvement of relations. And the Congress actually was an earmark. I don't like earmarks, but this was a good earmark, I think, which we got funded on to do our program in Palestine, because they're interested in the American image towards the Muslim world, and it was under that program we got funded.
Sylvia, any other?
I think there are two South African programs that are being sold to different parts of the world, and the one is Soul City, which you can look up on the internet, which is a drama around HIV/AIDS, and the other one is a collaboration with Sesame Street, which is an educational program for children, which is an animation called Takalani Sesame, which you can also find on the web.
All right, we have time for, I think, 2 more questions before we have to close it. Right beside you there, Justine, with Jerry. And then we've already had a question for you, so we'll take that lady just in front of you there.
I'm Jerry Eddings with the International Center for Journalists, and first I'd like to thank Steve McDonald and the Wilson Center's Africa program for putting on and organizing this discussion. I think it's been incredibly valuable, and I'd like to thank John Marks and Search for doing this amazing work with soap operas. I think it's very powerful what you're doing. I just want to make a quick comment. I don't think I so much have a question about the broader context that Steve referred to when someone asked the question about how this can be sustained, or how its power can come up against new conflicts. There is a broader context, and some of it is the kind of work that Steve and the Wilson Center do on conflict resolution with leaders, and some of it is the kind of work that ICFJ does, the organization that I work for, and there are a number of other media development organizations that go straight to the kind of problem that you saw with Radio Mille Collines, and we identify places where the media need to be worked on, need to be developed, need to be improved, where journalists need to understand the power of their medium and the responsibility that goes along with that. And we have media training and development programs all over the world. We're not the only ones. Internews and many other organizations do. But I think that our programs are incredibly effective because we're going into Haiti now following the big earthquake there to look at how journalists there can be trained to follow the money that's coming into the country. We went into Rwanda after the massacres to try to work with radio journalists there so that journalists so that there is a counterweight to, I think, the natural instincts of some people to do the negative and to fan the flames of trouble and conflict. And we have been training journalists throughout the world for like 25 years, so that in addition to the kind of thing that Search for Common Ground is doing, where you go directly to the public with television, in addition to the kind of work that the Wilson Center is doing, where you go to the leaders and work on them, there are also many successful attempts to ensure that journalists don't go for the lowest common denominator or the most or fan violence, and instead look at ways of responsibly engaging their publics and getting conversations and dialogues going that are positive for their communities and their countries.
Thank you, Jerry, for that intervention. That was very helpful. One question right in front here. Yes.
Thanks for taking my question. My name is Pia Sawhney. I'm loosely affiliated with the International Crisis Group. I was a media producer. I'm working in East Africa, and developing a documentary. was just curious whether, in some of your experiences, sort of calling the local storytelling traditions in some of the places that you're working in, what the sort of relationships are that you have with the governments in the countries that where you're operating. And so, for example, if local producers want to develop storytelling that's, interesting politically, and it seems like that is where you're headed in any case, how do you work with local actors to bridge any sorts of questions that they have about the productions, or questions that they have about shooting, or questions that they have about storytelling, because it's a sort of challenge that you spoke about in South Africa, where you want to build an interesting dramatic storyline, but it's a documentary, so you want to allow it to come locally from local production rather than from directors or producers, living in the United States. So I'm not sure if that question is entirely clear, but being that you're working in production and working in societies where conflict is raging, even below the surface, if it's not visible, but just below, what are some of your insights in dealing with all the different actors there, politically?
Seems a fair question.
Okay. We find local producers and writers. Now, often what they've done in the past doesn't comport with what we want to have done. It may be stylized. We try to do realistic. And in places you find it's often a drama tradition where people scream at each other all the time. Doesn't make for very good television. So younger people work better than older people usually because they haven't always learned all the lessons of how to do it. And there's a bit of a dance here. You need to find the right kinds of writers and the right kinds of producers. But this is called a co-production in television terms. And so we maintain a script integrity to get at the question that Sylvia was raising. We don't want to put junk on the air just because local writers think it's a good idea or something that's contrary to our values. So as the co-producer, we work in a collaborative way to make sure the scripts wind up the way that are acceptable to us. But all the plots things, whether the team is half girls or half boys, that's not our business. In other words, there's some things you give ground on and other things you don't, and the like. We did a co-production with Sesame in Macedonia, and there was a scene that the local writers put in where kids sat on the railroad tracks. And the Sesame people objected to that very strongly because it wasn't a safe place for kids to sit. And if you're doing American children's programming, you don't have kids sit on the railroad tracks. Well, we kind of felt, well, the writers thought it wasn't awful. And so we compromised. There was another scene where people were smoking. We agreed they shouldn't be smoking in the air, even though everybody in Macedonia seemed to smoke, but we let them sit on the railroad tracks. It was, there's a trade-off here. You don't want to be a cultural imperialist, but at the same time, you want to maintain values and standards. And you have to find a balance. There's no easy answer to the question you're raising. Each time we take them one at a time. We reject off-the-shelf approaches here.
Well, I thank you for all your input. We're going to close the questions, but if there's any closing remarks that any of our panelists want to make before we thank you for your presence, feel free. John?
I think this is a tremendous moment for folks that are working in this intersection of media and social change, because the tools are available that are never, when I was coming up and others, it was all one way. You made something, you sent it out, and it had an effect or not. And I just think and I hope you folks out there will think of ways that we haven't even conceived of to use these two-way techniques to start a conversation, because there's so much that the culture can teach us about how to engage them in better behavior.
Sylvia?
I think it's a tremendous project, and one of the things that excites me is that in South Africa we're now beginning to look at producing content like this, especially for mobisodes on people's cell phones. So taking popular content and producing mini versions of it for cell phones. So I think with television, and what is also important about this is the collaboration. So with TV and this kind of collaboration, the future is really extremely exciting.
I would just accentuate what my colleagues have said here. This is an extraordinary medium. There are all sorts of new ways that we haven't thought about. When you do a project like this, the unexpected results tend to be at least as interesting as the expected ones. You make things happen, and you learn each time, and it's a cumulative process, and you get better at it because you've learned things and the like. So, without having any hubris involved in this, this is just an evolving field which is very much at the beginning. And what's powerful about it is, as John put it, it's something that the world wants, and that there are now all these different kinds of media for getting things out. It used to be, for example, to make a documentary film, you had to have an awful lot of money. Now you can, if you want to shoot it yourself, you can edit it yourself, and you can make the whole film for almost no money. A lot of sweat, labor, and the like. And it's why the Sundance Festival gets about 20,000 entries a year, of which about 100 actually make it into theaters, or a very small percentage. But this is a growing way of expressing oneself, and it's very much in keeping with what the world seems to want and the way that it's been moving, so let's use it for constructive, transformative social purposes.
Okay, well, join me in thanking our marvelous panel and the film.